So I'm Lesley Jacques. I'm a beekeeper. I'm based in Cheshire. I run about 20-25 colonies depending on the time of the year. I've got a few years experience under my belt, but every day is a school day. There's always something to learn about, so let's see what we can find today. We're going to talk about getting the colonies through the winter. And at the time when we're actually shooting, it's August, so it feels like it's really early. But I've heard it said that there are 3 seasons in beekeeping. There is the time when your bees are in the winter, there's getting your bees out of the winter, and then there's preparing for the next winter. Everything in the meantime is incidental. So we've got a reasonable hive setup here. As you can see, it's a standard national. It's on double brood. It's got 1 super on the top. It's a pretty standard setup for beekeepers in the UK. Trying to keep things really simple, there are a few key things that we need to think about for the winter. We need to make sure that the colony has sufficient critical mass, that it's actually big enough. We need to make sure that the colony is healthy. We need to make sure that it's adequately fed, so it's got enough stores to see it through that period when there's no forage and there's nothing available for the bees. And we need to make sure that the equipment is sound, that the bees are protected, and that they're not going to be interfered with by mice, by badgers, by woodpeckers, by storms, by rain, all of those things. So both animals, creatures, and acts of nature. First, when we're actually checking colony health, one of the key things we really need to be careful with for the winter preparation is varroa, because of the effects it can have on the colony systemically, the colony as a whole. So we really need to make sure that the varroa levels are as low as possible, so that when the colony is developing those really important winter bees, those winter bees, the ones that are going to be in there for perhaps 4 months, 5 months, they're as healthy as possible. Now ideally we will have been monitoring for varroa all the way through the season, but at this time of year getting the varroa levels down to a bare minimum is really important. There's a number of different ways of monitoring for varroa. The simple one, the one that most of us sort of learn about in the first instance, and I suppose my favourite, is to do a varroa drop, a natural varroa drop. So we'll have an inspection board. This is one of my inspection boards that slides into the open mesh floor. So you can see this one has a mesh drawn on it, which makes it much easier to count anything, to assess anything that's falling onto the board. The board goes in I leave mine in for a week. That fits with my beekeeping schedule. After a week I will take the board out and count any varroa mites which have actually landed on the board. Having the squares makes that so much easier, I don't lose count. I can then go on to the National Bee Unit website where there's some quite handy figures. It will tell you, when you calculate your daily mite drop from that, what that actually equates to in terms of the number of mites that you've got in the colony as a whole. So if I had, let's say I had 77 mites drop out of the colony over an exposure period of a week, I know that my daily mite drop is 11. What does that translate to in terms of the number of mites in the colony? Well, it depends on the time of year. And so really, without wanting to get into the complexities of the algorithm, go onto the National Bee Unit website, have a look at the information that they've got there for doing the varroa calculator. It will also tell you whether, with the varroa levels you have in the colony at any given time, do you need to treat for varroa urgently? Do you need to keep an eye on it, or is everything okay? And you can choose what you do in terms of treatment, if that's what it requires, depending on the time of year, depending on where you are in the country. There's lots of different treatments available. There are thymol-based treatments, so essential oil-based treatments, which take quite a long exposure period. There are formic acid-based treatments, so my treatment of choice is Formic Pro. It has a short exposure period. And there are chemical pesticides, so taufluvalinate and others, which are coming up against some problems at the moment because of resistance issues. So yes, they're okay to use, but don't repeat it year on year, because we're really asking for problems with resistant mites developing. Once you're happy that that colony is healthy, we need to also make sure that it's got enough stores. Well, how do we do that? Check what's actually going on inside, and for this we need to go into the colony. A brood frame in a national brood chamber of this sort, when it's full of honey, weighs about 5 pounds. And a good sized colony will need anything up to about 40 pounds to get through the winter. So you need to have at least 8 frames full of stores as a minimum for that colony to be able to easily get through the winter. If you don't have that amount of stores in the colony, then you'll need to feed. Feeding at this time of year should be a thick sugar syrup or a proprietary bee feed. I use a rapid feeder, which will get a large amount of feed into the colony all in one go. There are some things you need to remember in doing this. There's a risk of setting up robbing, for example, in the apiary. So when you feed one colony, do it in the evening. Cut down on any chaos with flying bees. If you're feeding on an apiary basis, feed all of the colonies at the same time. And that way it doesn't alert any flying bees to the fact that there is stores available in one place and not somewhere else. The rapid feeders that we tend to use generally are of this type. So this will sit on the top of the crown board. The bees can enter through this cone at the bottom, and the protective cup just stops the bees getting into the syrup reservoir. We can fill those up with syrup. Of this sort, that will need an eek or an empty super around it, something just to make sure that it has space on the top of the crown board. So we see when we take the crown board off, the feeder just sits on top of the vent hole, just like that. That's nice and easy. If you have out apiaries, these so-called big green feeders, and they're literally called big green feeders, is like a giant version of the rapid feeder, so you can see the cones inside. And this one will sit straight onto the top of the frames, and the feeder goes on top of the colony, just making sure that there's no gaps, and you can fill with feed inside. And these will hold about 3 gallons of feed, which is enough to see any colony through the winter. So we know the colony's healthy, we know the colony's fed. Is the colony adequately protected? Well, looking at this setup, I can see that these components are in good condition. So everything is fine, all of the boxes, they sit closely, there's no leakage, there's no potential for robbing, there's no potential for example, wasps to get in or mice to get in. But of course, mice can get in the entrance. Now, this particular hive has a rather nice underneath entrance block in there, but they don't all. Generally, I will be closing the entrances down using a different entrance block like this that has a smaller entrance. And here's one I prepared earlier. And a mouse guard which goes over the entrance, just with a couple of drawing pins to make sure that the bees are able to enter through the holes there. But the holes are just that little bit too small for a mouse to fit through. Now these are actually really important because they're as cheap as chips. They're very easy to fit. They can stay on through the whole winter. A mouse really likes a warm place to sit over the winter, but they will make a terrible, terrible mess if they get ingress to the colony. They will destroy the combs, they will eat the honey, they'll build nests in there, so they really will completely destroy the interior of the colony. And just as bad, bees will really avoid any comb which has been contaminated with mouse urine. So this is really useful to keep our little furry friends at bay. Similarly, if you are in an area where there is trouble with green woodpeckers, at this time of year, not a problem. But as we go into the winter, their natural food sources, so various insects and so on, they become quite scarce. The woodpeckers get hungry, and they can learn a behaviour to burrow into the side of the beehive, where they will take honey and they will take larvae. The woodpecker will need to grip the side of the colony to get purchase on the box. The only way to really stop them doing that is to put something on or around the hive which will stop them getting close to the sides of the brood chamber. There are a number of different ways to do this. Wrapping the colony in, for example, a chicken wire or something of that sort, that will work quite well. It stops the woodpeckers getting too close to the boxes. Similarly, this sort of material, which is a semi-permeable membrane, again will stop the woodpecker getting close to the timber, but because it's semi-permeable, it will ventilate, and so it doesn't cause any dampness within the brood chamber. So the bees are healthy, the bees are fed, the bees are safe and dry. What do we need to do with them now over the winter? Well, nothing. It's really key that the bees are allowed to winter quietly, that they're allowed to winter safely. We can do some non-invasive checks throughout the winter period to make sure that the bees do have enough stores. And it's worth learning to heft your hives. Certainly if you haven't done it before, it's an easy process, but it does take a little bit of practice and a bit of familiarity. When I'm hefting my hives, I take the roof off because the roof is heavy. And then the hefting process is simply to fingers underneath the recess and just give it a lift, just so that we can see what's the weight of that hive. Do the other side as well, because quite often the stores inside isn't evenly distributed. There might be more to one side than there will to the other, and hefting both sides will just give you an indicator of how much is in there. If you run more than one colony, it becomes obvious very quickly if one of them is a little bit light. A good sized colony, a single brood box, a double brood box like this particularly, which is full of stores for the winter, should be almost too heavy to lift. And it won't lose very much weight up until probably February or March time. At that point, when the queen is starting to lay again and there's more brood starting to appear in the colony, their need for nutrition goes up. And the amount of stores in that colony will drop quite a lot more quickly. So the really key time to be making sure that there is enough reserves in the colony for the remainder of the winter is the late winter and the early spring. Just keep an eye on it. If you feel that it's getting a little bit light, then some fondant, some baker's fondant or a proprietary fondant on the top of the top bars, directly onto the top bars, will make sure that the bees don't starve until there's any natural forage available for them. And I would like to say it's as easy as that. Don't overthink it, keep it simple, but 3 basic rules. Make sure that the bees are healthy, particularly for Varroa. Make sure that the bees are adequately fed and that there's enough stores in the brood box to see them through the winter. And make sure that the hive is protected against rodents and also against bad weather. Make sure that your equipment is sound, your roofs are sound, strap it down if you need to. And above that, close the lid, don't be tempted to fiddle about with it, leave them to go through the winter peacefully. There's plenty of activity going on here. All of these bees that you can see flying in circles facing the colony, they're young bees who either haven't been out before or they've only been out once or twice. They're orienting, so these are their orientation flights. It usually happens middle of the afternoon on a sunny day. And they are getting used to where they live. They're familiarising themselves with the front of their colony, and as they become more and more familiar, they will take larger and larger circles until they graduate onto full foraging duties. Yesterday, so we can have a look at the daily mite drop. So there's 1 or 2 Varroa coming out of this colony. So there's one. These pinhead-sized, shiny, dark brown mites there. I can only see a couple. 2, 3, not too bad so far. So we're just going to go in, have a look, check the brood, make sure this colony is healthy as part of the pre-winter preparations. It's looking at what we've got at the entrance. It's a good strong colony. There are plenty of foragers here. If you can see the bees coming in and out of the entrance, they've got a little trace of white pollen on the back of the thorax. And I can see there's a huge stand of Himalayan balsam up the hill. So these girls are on the balsam. They'll be bringing back pollen, but it's a really good nectar. It's a really valuable nectar. I think a few years ago there was a study done around which forage species are the most valuable for bees, and Himalayan balsam actually came out top of the ranking as being one of those which is one of the most valuable species for insect pollinators. I know it polarises opinion because it's an invasive species, but it's great for the bees and it makes fabulous honey. Oh well, that's good. Propolis is like super important. Oh yes, it is sticky, isn't it? So you can see how if you're not careful, the frames come up with the super because of the amount of propolis on there. There we are, that one's free. There's a really good propolis deposit on there. And even though this colony's got 4 supers on, each of those supers is full of bees. There's a lot of activity here. It's a good strong colony. I'm just levering up between the supers, just trying not to jar the components. Bees really dislike vibration. So the more gentle we can be, the better. Same applies in removing the queen excluder, just being quite gentle, especially when the colony is as propolisy as this one is. Propolisy, I think, is a good word. I'm just going to check the underside of here, just to make sure that the queen isn't on the underside of the queen excluder. I can't see the queen. Doesn't mean she's not there, but I can't see her. So yeah, we've got a nice busy colony. There's plenty of bees in there. It's a good strong colony. I'd be very happy with this colony, to be fair. So I'm going to go through each of the frames. We'll have a look at what's there. We'll assess how much stores there is in the brood box for the winter, and also have a look at the colony health, just to make sure that everything seems to be okay. That there's no sign of any notifiable disease, that there's no sign of anything that's going to compromise the colony health over the winter. Dummy board out first. And with this frame, I'm expecting that this will be stores. Oh, it's got brood on, my word. Okay, they have been busy, haven't they? There's still a little bit of drone brood and some open brood on there. So just a sharp shake will take the bees off the comb. What I'm looking for here is to have a look at the larvae, make sure that we've got healthy open larvae. So they should be pearly, they should be white in colour, they should be quite clearly segmented and glossy, and lying comfortable in a C shape in the bottom of the cell. They shouldn't be discoloured, they shouldn't be slumped, they shouldn't be uncomfortable looking larvae. The sealed brood, this looks nice. It's even, the brood is even. The cappings are dry. There's no perforations. This one's actually just being sealed up. That's not been perforated. And they're dry and they're a nice golden biscuity colour. Think digestive biscuits. Now I've had a good look just to make sure that Her Majesty isn't on this frame, because I really don't want to set the frame aside with the queen on it. She's not there. I'm just going to take this one out of the way just to give us a little bit of working space. Yeah, there's plenty of brood in here and they're doing quite nicely. They're backfilling some of the empty cells with nectar, but I know, we've got 4 supers on there, and although they're heavy, they're not super heavy. They're not absolutely full, so the colony does have some space. And just a sharp shake downwards will take the bees off the comb so that we can see more clearly what's going on with that brood. And that looks nice. There she is. Can you see her? She's right in the middle of the frame. Yeah. So she is, yeah. Clearly, let's just shake the bees off so we can see what's going on. So the Miller frame has been put in as part of a queen rearing exercise. A zigzag pattern would have been cut in the comb in the hope that the bees would then raise queen cells on the young larvae, the eggs and young larvae that are on the edges. And where the comb has been cut away, so you can see this is worker comb with worker brood, but where they've built new comb around, this is all drone. So they've backfilled the gap with drone comb. This is a very good idea. So the frames are marked with the year that they went into the colony. So it just helps in terms of the frame rotation, making sure that the frames aren't in there for too long. They get changed in good time. The pollen's really important because it's the bee's primary protein source, and they will need that pollen, well, for 2 things at this time of year. Obviously for their regular brood rearing, but also it helps the development of the winter bees, and those are the winter bees that are going to be in the colony right through until next spring. So nutrition on all levels is really important, but pollen at this time of year is particularly valuable. I'm not seeing any greasy cells, no sunken cappings, no perforations. That looks perfect. More evidence of queen rearing here.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, when I've done this, I find exactly the same happens. That the bees, they'll even off the holes, but they don't actually build extra comb in those. And I think they quite like just having that little bit of a back door onto the next frame. This pollen barrier, so there's no brood on this frame. There's an awful lot of pollen, not very much stores. Says to me we've reached the end of the brood nest. And that's typical. There won't be any brood on the other two frames, so I'm not going to go in there and look at those. If you think about the way that the brood nest is inside this brood box, imagine something which is roughly spherical, possibly rugby ball shaped. You can see when you take a frame out, there'll be brood in the centre and there'll be pollen arch over the top. But if you think about it in 3 dimensions, this is the edge. So there wouldn't ordinarily be another pollen barrier at the close end of the brood box. In this case, the queen has laid, we've got brood all the way onto the last frame. But finding that pollen barrier is quite nice. I know that I've reached the end of the brood nest there. Right, let's close these girls up. So I'm just going to leave the frames up gently. This is a really nice strong colony and will easily go through the winter as a standalone colony. If the colony is smaller, there are 2 things that I might think about doing. Assuming, of course, that the colony is healthy but just small, it may have been a late season swarm or something of that sort. I would either unite it with another colony. I would choose the best queen. There can only ever be one queen, and I would unite it to give one strong colony, because one strong colony will overwinter much more successfully than two small colonies. Alternatively, I might put that colony into a polynuke, a 6-frame polynuke. They're really well insulated. They're fantastic for overwintering small colonies. They will easily hold enough stores to overwinter a small 6-frame colony quite successfully, particularly if they're in a sheltered environment. Up here, we're in quite an open environment. It's a little bit windy, but you know, a small nucleus colony can quite easily be taken home into the garden, just popped in a corner to overwinter, where it would have a much better chance, I think. So, you know, depending upon the size of the colonies, a strong colony, no problem at all. A weaker colony or a smaller colony, first of all check that it's healthy. No point uniting a colony with one which is weak through disease. That's a whole different question. But if the colony is healthy but small, then yeah, either unite with another colony to make one larger entity, or pop it in a polynuke for the winter. So we've been through this colony. It's in good order for the winter. At the moment, it's got 4 supers on, and those supers will have to be extracted before the winter, but the colony is strong. Once the supers are off, I'd be putting a feeder on just to make sure that there's enough food in the brood box for the colony through the winter. Possibly leave a super underneath the brood box as well. At the moment, there's very little stores in the brood box. There's a lot of brood. The queen has been doing her job, but she'll need the stores over the winter. We check the health. The health of the colony is really good. The brood is all very healthy. The adult bees are healthy. The colony is active. The colony is quite calm. The queen is laying. It's queen right. Everything's going well. I'd be quite content that this is a good, strong colony going into the winter, and should come out of the winter next spring without any difficulty at all. It's quite a lot to remember, and you know, those who've got a few years experience, we do it instinctively. But in the early years, it can be quite hard to remember all the things that we have to do at this time of year because it is critical. I used to find it quite helpful to write a checklist, to check the frames, to check the brood, and to check the health of the colony. To do a varroa measurement, so putting the inspection board in and just having a look at the National Bee Unit figures to make sure that there is not a huge varroa loading in the colony. If there is, and that colony needs to be treated, check what treatments are available and what time of the year it is, what works for you. And there are lots of different treatments to choose from. What else do we need to have on the checklist? Make sure that the bees have got enough stores. This brood box should contain about 40 pounds of stores for the winter. When it's full, it should be almost too heavy to lift. So you know then if that colony is really weighty, there are sufficient stores. Each brood frame will hold about 5 pounds of stores, so you need at least 8 or 9 brood frames full of sealed stores to see through the winter. Apply your mouse guards if you need to. I always put mouse guards on because they cost £2 for one mouse guard, which is a lot cheaper than trying to replace all of your combs. Leave them alone for the winter. Let your bees get on with hunkering down for the winter, keeping warm. Check them regularly just to make sure, heft the weight of the hive, just to make sure that there's sufficient there. But they will be good to go through until February, March. At that point, a lot of the stores will have been used and they might start to get a little bit light. But if they've got sufficient from the winter onwards, you may only need to add a patty of fondant on the top bars much later in the winter or the early spring. But in terms of the winter preparation, with all of those things satisfied, we should be good for this colony to go through the winter.